What role did Spain play in the winning of American independence? We're going to explore this important question today on AmRev360. I'm Scott Stephenson, President and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And I'm joined today by Dr. Gonzalo M. Quintero Saravia, Ambassador Quintero Saravia, who's also an accomplished historian and expert on this very subject. And you are joining us from your present post in Lima, in Peru.
Yes,
where you serve as deputy head of mission. Fantastic. Well, I'd love to just start by asking you a little bit about your background. You know, where were you born? Where did you grow up? Maybe a little bit about when you first began to think about the intertwined histories of the United States and Spain.
As many Spaniards, I was born abroad. I was not born in Spain. I was born here in Lima, in Peru, where my father came in the late 50s and early 60s in order to improve his life in Spain. At that time was a very poor country, just getting out of a civil war, and it was not easy for him to find somewhere to work even in Spain. So he went to South America. He met my mother. They married in Argentina. My mother was from Argentina. And then he suddenly got a job here in Peru, and I was born here, where I lived my first 5 years. Then he returned to Spain, and I lived there. Mm-hmm.
So educated in Spain, but with a deep roots, origins in the far-flung corners of Spain's American Empire in the early colonial period. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
You know, it'd be interesting for our viewers. I think it would be interesting to before we get into the life of Bernardo de Galvez, sort of set the scene a little bit for the 18th century, the time of America's War of Independence. To talk a little bit about Spain's relationship with other monarchies in Europe, and it's sort of the it of course was a very old presence in the Western Hemisphere at the time of the American Revolution. What is your sort of executive summary of what those who are interested viewers, but maybe not deeply steeped in the history, what should they know about Spain and the future United States and the Western Hemisphere in the 18th century?
First, regarding Spain and what is called today the US, 2/3 of actually what is today the continental US in the 1780s was under the theoretical, at least, sovereignty of Spain. So most of what you'd call today the US was under Spanish rule. It was not exactly so, because most of it was in theory, but those who were actually governing there were the Native Americans, which were the ones living there, and the Spanish presence north of Rio Grande was very slim, especially concentrated in the coast and in the south, in the Caribbean. That means Louisiana, that means the Floridas. And the importance of this was to protect the routes from Mexico and Peru towards Spain, and Cuba towards Spain, and vice versa. So it was the time of the biggest territorial expand of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. What is called today the American Revolution, actually, it was just one of those confrontations between the three empires that ruled Europe at the time. Europe and most of the world at the time, meaning France, Spain, and UK. And Spain has been in war with Great Britain since the very beginning, and it was just another confrontation. The last one before the American Revolution was the 7 Years' War. And always these wars had strange names, because before the 7 Years' War, there was the War of Jenkins' Ear, then the 7 Years' War, which is a name that was given after that, because during the war, you never knew it was going to be last 7 years. And the American Revolution is called in the US, but it was just another war between the empires.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit then about Bernardo de Galvez, who would become such a prominent figure in Spain's involvement in the Revolutionary War, the American War of Independence. What was his
Yeah,
background? What part of Spain was he from?
yeah, the second half of the 18th century in Spain was a time of reforms. In the beginning of the 18th century, a new dynasty came to Spain, the Bourbon dynasty from the French origin, and that sealed the alliance between France and Spain, mostly against Great Britain. And Bernardo de Galvez is an example of how these reforms were taking place in Spain. A new class of civil servants were reaching the highest echelons of power. The uncle of Bernardo de Galvez, he was born extremely poor in the south of Spain, and he was a brilliant guy, a brilliant lawyer, who became the right hand of Charles III, the Spanish monarch at the time, and he became the Minister for the Indies. And because of his patronage, Bernardo de Galvez was able to have some very important responsibilities from an early age. He was posted the first time in the Americas, in Mexico, the first time he went to the Americas, because he was the nephew of this important person. But after that, he succeeded in accomplishing real important feats that gave him the opportunity to have other postings. The second time he went into the Americas was as governor, actually acting governor of Louisiana. Louisiana was a recent acquisition by the Spanish Empire, because previously it was French till the end of the 7 Years' War. So it was a complicated time for the region. You must remember that when Spain took the government of Louisiana, the people there revolt against Spain that had to be crushed. And one of the reasons he was appointed to as acting governor to Louisiana and colonel of the regiment there, it was because he spoke fluently French, because his baptism of fire was done under French flag. So because at the time when he wanted to enter the Spanish army, his family had not risen so high yet, so he was unable to buy a commission in a Spanish regiment. But since his uncle was the lawyer of the French embassy, he was able to have a commission as officer in the French army. That was pretty common at the time.
Yeah, of course, very familiar to us that the Continental Army, employs French officers,
German officers,
yeah. Polish. So it is a kind of international kind of military class that serves different princes during this period.
Yeah, we're talking at a time that nationalism was not born yet. The sentiment of nationalism was not born. Actually, the beginning of nationalism in Great Britain has been dated from the second half of the 18th century. The beginning of nationalism in France is the French Revolution, and the beginning of nationalism in Spain was not until the French invasion, the Napoleonic invasion in 1808. So it's a completely different world. Nations were not there yet. Empires there were, but the way empires behave and the ways nations behave is completely different.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to remember that just because the maps look similar to today, or the territories, have a name on them, that thinking about who the people are that are living there, what are the languages that are being spoken, what are their allegiances, and certainly those empires could not take for granted the allegiance of people who were living in those territories.
Exactly.
So for how long before the outbreak of the war between Britain and its colonies was Galvez present in Louisiana? And sort of what were, in addition to facing this initial rebellion, this is presumably former French colonists who are resisting the imposition of Spanish control. How had that sort of settled out? I know there had probably been some movement of colonial British merchants, I know, filtering down into that area as well. And so what were the sort of strides and challenges that he faced just at the time that then this war would break out to the north?
And in his instructions, the main thing he had to accomplish is to ensure the loyalty of the local population. And he did that through several means. First, he was fluent in French, which was a very good thing. Second, he accomplished making the Louisianians comfortable with the Spanish rule. mainly changing some of the general rules in which the Spanish government settled for the rest of the Americas. And most of the time he spent writing back and forth with his uncle, the Minister of Indies at the time, in order to get that special treatment for Louisiana, for the special characteristics of the population, of the territory, of the commerce through the Mississippi. And then by another important, and last but not least, by marrying a Louisianan woman, the daughter of one of the richest merchants in the city, and completely falling in love with her. And she was really, really important in order to keep Galvez informed and aware of the sentiments of the local population. By the second year in his term as governor, he had the complete support of the local population, which allowed him not only to go to war against the Brits, but also a great part of his troops were recruited locally, and lots of them were voluntaries from Louisiana who fought in the war against the British. So he did a very good job at that.
Yeah, I find visitors to the Museum of the American Revolution are often quite surprised to learn of all the military action that took place sort of on the Gulf Coast of what's now Florida, Louisiana, and this region. We're accustomed to thinking about sort of Bunker Hill and Yorktown and points in between, perhaps aware of some of the actions that took place out in the Illinois country or in Western Pennsylvania. But this is pretty far afield for, I think, many people's consciousness about the War of Independence. Can you sort of sketch out a little bit, just like what some of the major points were along that timeline? Of course, 1778 is when France formally allies itself, signs its treaty with the fledgling United States. Spain's entry comes after that as an ally of France against the British. And then what sort of happens then down in the Louisiana Territory, British West Florida?
What's important to remember is the American Revolution it was not only an American Revolution, it was a global war. The first global war was called by Churchill the Jenkins-Year War, but here too, the American Revolution was a global war too. The largest battle of the American Revolution was fought in Gibraltar in Spain. That battle was the biggest one because it involved the largest army and the largest navy of all the battles fought during that war. Also, there was an Asian theater. There were fights between the French and the Brits in India, and also in the coast of Africa. So there were also attempts by the Brits to conquer parts of Central America belonging at the time to Spain. There was also an attempt by the French and the Spanish to invade the British Isles that was abandoned. So the theater of the operations of the North American side were in what you call the America, but actually is the northern part of the Americas. There were several theaters of operations there. And one of the biggest ones was the South, and the South meaning the Caribbean, because we must not forget that Florida and Louisiana are the northern part of the Caribbean. And that was a theater of operations that was crucial because it had to protect the Spanish colonies there, the French colonies there, and also, and most importantly, because the jewel of the crown in the Americas for the Brits was not New York, was not Boston, was actually Jamaica. And the threat of invading Jamaica was one of the key reasons why the British relinquished their possessions in what is called now the United States. So it was a global war. And the entrance of France in the war actually made what was before a revolt, a rebellion, and a war for independence, transformed it into a global war in a sense, but in a limited sense. But at the time France entered, she was the naval forces of France were a little bit more than a half of the Brits. So the British forces were able to strike wherever they want, whenever they want. But with the entry of Spain, that had stopped, and the Brits had to assume a more defensive position. And the initiative went exactly to the other side, to the Franco-Spanish side. But not only that, but Spanish sell her entrance into the war very, very, very high. The price was very high. That meant that the priorities of Spain, which were regaining the Floridas and also controlling the whole Caribbean, and also regaining Gibraltar, was the main objective in the war. So that changed completely the war in the moment Spain entered into it.
And then I know some of the fighting closer to, in the Louisiana region, I remember first reading about the fact that there was actually a battle at St. Louis, which is again not involving the Continental Army. But can you say a little bit about the places that Galvez personally took a military command, going from being governor and sort of putting his sword back on his side and actually leading troops in action against British forces?
There was, and it's also important, very important to keep in mind that Spain was never an ally of the United States. Spain was an ally of France. The United States was an entity that was not recognized by Spain till later, for a couple of reasons. First, because it was a bad example for her own colonies. So don't try to help someone who's going to try to get rid of its own colonial power. It's not a good example for your own colonized.
Yep.
Secondly, it was the usual thing that empires do at the time. When Catalonia revolted against the central government in Spain in the 1640s, the Brits helped that rebellion. But when the Scots rebelled several times against the English government, Spain also was involved in helping the Scots, but also helping the Irish. So it was the usual way of how empires deal with each other, trying to weaken the other side. And on the other side, also, it's important to understand that Spain at the time had a border with the British Empire in North America. And the alternative was, if there's a new country there, which is going to be much weaker than the British Empire, it's better for the Spanish government to have a weaker neighbor than a powerful one. And also, we must remember that the structure of the US till the Constitution was extremely weak. Also, the armed forces, both naval and army, from the United States were extremely weak compared to the British. So the alternative was, I would rather have this new entity, this republic, as a neighbor, because it's going to be much easier to deal with than with the British Empire. Of course, they were wrong, but they were wrong 40 years later. It was no way to they could advance that before. And also the usual thing that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But there were never combined operations between the US and Spain. There were never allies. They were simply fighting the same enemy.
So as a diplomat, do any of these lessons resonate with you today? Some things never change, right?
Some things never change, but that started with Roman Empire, yes.
Right. I'm curious, how is Galvez remembered today in Spain, in maybe Spain's former colonies, and most importantly, in the United States?
Don't make the distinction between the Spanish former colonies and the US, because the US was a Spanish former colony too.
Of course, yes.
Two-thirds of it.
Yeah.
No, seriously. Yeah. Seriously now, as actually Bernardo de Galvez is much better known in the US than in Spain now. There are several efforts by several organizations to promote the knowledge of this figure. There are initiatives about putting some statues and things like that. But the first statues and the country in which there are more statues of Bernardo de Galvez and plaques and everything is the US. Not only the South, but also there's a big one behind the US State Department in Washington. So actually it's better known in the US than it is actually in Spain.
Fantastic. Although, do I remember that there is a tradition in his hometown in Spain of celebrating the 4th of July? Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a place in Spain called Macharabiaya, which is even difficult to pronounce for a Spaniard. Macharavilla is in the southern Spain. Malaga is the town, the little village where the Galvezes were born. And they were really poor. They were really peasants. And after they became one of the most powerful families in the Spanish Empire, his uncle Jose de Galvez became a marquis. Bernardo became a count. And after that, they poured a lot of money into that village in order to change it from a peasant poor village into something they could be proud of. So what the present mayor of Macharavilla had done in the last 15 years is trying to revive that history, trying to attract tourism. And what he does is every 4th of July, he does a reenactment of the Battle of Pensacola involving the whole village. They dress in Spanish and American and British uniforms, and they reenact the Battle of Pensacola. And now they have like 20,000, 25,000, mainly American tourists go every year for that, which is absolutely great.
Sounds like a trip we should organize with the Museum of the American Revolution.
That would be absolutely great. It actually is the only place outside the U.S. and not in a military base that they sing the Star Spangled Banner with a Spanish accent. The whole village is wonderful. It's amazing.
Fantastic. Well, I know our time's drawing near, but I wanted to ask you. We're mindful here in Philadelphia of the approaching 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. The museum is beginning to work on an exhibition called The Declaration's Journey that will explore the influence of the Declaration of Independence sort of through the last 250 years, not just through American history, but its influence around the globe, its continuing relevance today. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts, any aspirations about how we should be thinking about the upcoming 250th.
I'm very close to the U.S. I studied there and I lived there both in New York and Washington for almost a decade. My oldest son was born there in the U.S. The thing is that the U.S. is a peculiar country because the United States is more than a country, it's an idea. An idea based on the values, both of the Constitution and both of the Declaration of Independence. You represent the values of the Enlightenment. So it's very difficult for the rest of the world sometimes to understand the US because from the national parameters that we normally work with, you can be a Spaniard, you can be a Frenchman, and you can be whatever you want to be. But when you're an American, it's completely different. The values of the Enlightenment are completely embedded in your culture and in the idea of your country. That has been done a lot of good for the world, a lot of good for the world. And the times, I believe that when the US forgets those values, that creates problems, not only for the US, but also for the rest of the world. And I would like to see how in that celebration of the American independence, those are the values which I strongly believe are still applicable today. And those are the values that could make the world a much better place. And those values should be stressed because those are the values of the people believed at that time. And I think they are universal because they're derived from reason. As the Declaration of Independence, how do you say it? Self-evident, no? Fantastic.
Well, I couldn't think of a better point to end on. That is absolutely beautiful, aspirational, is an excellent expression of the way the museum is trying to ensure that the promise of the American Revolution endures, particularly during these difficult and divided times when we're living with so many challenges. So Ambassador, thank you for joining us. Of course, you're no stranger to the museum here, and I look forward to your next visit when you're in Philadelphia. And I certainly encourage all of our viewers to make sure that they read this excellent biography that you've written of Bernardo de Galvez, and we'll make sure that the information about ordering it is available in the link to the program. So thank you very much. Be well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.